Well, hello, Next Reel fans. We have gathered together to create something brand new. And at this point, even we aren't sure what bizarre shape this is going to take. Only one thing we know is it's going to be terrifying. We have come together because all of us have a particular interest in horror movies and the horror genre. However, just saying the word horror movie encompasses a huge amount of different areas and ideas and things that we like and what we don't, what scares us and what doesn't. So we're going to be sort of talking a little bit about that and then what it covers. So I am a host, but not necessarily the host. My name is Kyle. You'll find me on the Curiosity Codex podcast and also the Cool Time Dice Hour. Let's see. Immediately on the screen I see to my right is the handsomest man in podcasting, Mr. Tommy Metz.
Hi, everybody. It's me. I've been here. And it is a pleasure to be a part of this horror experience, especially because we're the first ones to come up with the idea for a horror
That's
podcast.
right. It's amazing. Search for horror podcast and nothing comes up.
Right.
All right. So then catty corner down from me is the man with the second best beard on the podcast, Mr. Ray Deland.
Hello. This podcast is purely and simply evil.
And holding the Alice place for the French fan, because what's more terrifying than the white 70s family? It's our own podcast impresario, Mr. Pete Wright.
I don't know how to do this if I'm living by my motto, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. I don't know how to do this podcast.
That's your motto?
That's my motto.
So basically what we want to do is we wanted to talk about the horror movies and horror genre and stuff too, but all of us come from different perspectives and have different things. So we wanted to, let's talk a little bit about sort of where we came into it. So Tommy, tell me about sort of when you first, like the first horror movie, I guess, that made a huge impression on you that went, oh, I want to see more of this.
I remember the first horror movie that I saw that it made me want to see less of it, which was, it was not a horror movie. It was the first VHS movie that my parents ever got. And they didn't know what it was, and it was Watership Down. And seeing rabbits kill each other and run from a fire. I was like, well, this is a real pass. I don't remember, unfortunately, I come a little unprepared. I don't remember when it started, but I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in being scared, haunted houses, horror movies, stuff like that. As
the
people
DNA.
know, in the DNA, and I think part of it might be, at risk of getting a little serious, is, Pete and I co-host What's That Smell, a funny podcast about anxiety. And I think maybe because I had a healthy amount of anxiety or fear in my life, seeing horror movies, doing scary things was a way of initiating a little bit of control. One of the reasons that they say that people like watching horror movies is because it lets you sort of rehearse or go through a scary situation in a safe space. And then at some point I stopped using it as control and just really got into the entire genre. So
Wait a minute. I don't mean to, I have to step in here. Tom, you haven't told the complete story. Would you please tell your childhood
controversy
antics?
Already?
You have to, this is a table setting story for how you came to horror.
Well,
please talk about your basement.
I used to try to scare myself as much as I could. When my parents would go out sometimes out on the town doing parents things, I would go down into my basement or into my garage and turn off all the lights and sit there in the middle of the floor and try to think of all the scariest things possible to see if I could out scare myself.
Wow.
And have to run and turn on the lights. So I was already boundary pushing in a weird way, like a real single child creep, only child creep that I was. And then luckily at some point we got a dog. Yeah, so I've always been really interested in pushing some of those ideas and boundaries and seeing what is the scariest kind of thing for me. So horror movies is a great way to do that.
That's interesting that you talk. I hadn't actually heard about that in terms of anxiety and preparing yourself for worst case scenarios. I think maybe that is actually what got me out of horror, and now I'm only sort of stepping back in, is because when I similarly, I don't have a beginning thing like this was the movie that changed everything. It was like, I think like you, the weird guy from Maine was the one who sort of opened the doors. And so Stephen King was for me like reading Stephen King books and then going into adaptations, and then that way sort of
I'm
led
so
me.
sorry. I'm 100% that way too. That I
Oh.
started reading
Yeah.
short stories by Stephen King.
Yeah.
The first things that I started reading when I was really, really reading was Skeleton Crew and
Yeah.
Night Shift.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that makes sense that I started with the written word. I'm so sorry to hijack your words, but I want to
No,
riff
no,
on
I
and say
kind
that
of think
that's
you and I
also
have
me.
talked about this offline, so I thought
Yeah.
we have a similarity
You're
in
exactly
terms
right.
of that. But I sort of got out of the horror game when it got into, and I was working at the movie theaters. That was during like 2000, 2010 sort of period. That's when the Eli Rothness of it all came in, and then suddenly there was no final girl, and the monsters were winning. And like for me, I was like, oh, I don't want this. Like I don't like it was a weird time in the country and stuff too, but it
Right.
was all of a sudden everything was very nihilistic. And not that I necessarily need a happy ending on a horror movie, but I need the ending to justify what I've just gone through. Like
Mhm.
I'm not here to just watch a college girl go through the worst 72 hours of her life and then die on screen.
Right, because that's just
No.
exploitation. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and always. I mean, the same thing. I think like well, at some point we'll probably talk about The Descent. I love the original ending of The Descent, and I don't like the director's version because I feel like
Mm.
that the character earned the
way
happy ending, or happy,
Sure.
quote unquote happy ending, as opposed to like, ha, no. Like, but the story it's in like a true romance kind of way, and like they earned their way out of it. They went through some stuff and came out at the end of it, as opposed
Right.
to Quentin's original version, which is that they all die. It was like, but
I didn't know that.
yeah, in
I
his
didn't know
original
that was
draft,
the original.
it was like
They all
I think,
died in the
no,
hotel room?
it was Christian Slater's character, Clarence dies.
Clarence.
Like
Oh,
he
okay.
dies in the final thing or whatever. And so, but it was Tony Scott who went, no, they deserve a happy ending. Like they
Yeah.
really have.
They worked for it.
They worked
earned
for
it.
it. They've earned
Yeah.
it. So
I
that was
have all
what
this
sort of,
xylophone music to still use. Let's watch him play on a beach.
Hans Zimmer got a brand new xylophone.
Right,
He's
just for
demanding
this.
that I use it. All right, so then let's go. Let's shift to you then, Pete. What was it that you have come to horror sort of later? But what was it that sort of got you in?
It's interesting that you guys bring up the written word because I actually have had much less trouble reading horror books or horrific things than watching them. When I was, let's see, the year, I think it was it 1979 when Salem's Lot came out, which meant it came out on probably Betamax in 1981, 82, somewhere in there. So I was a young person and Dad brought it home and said, here, watch this. Let's watch this together. And then I watched it and he said, I have to take a phone call, and left me alone in the den and closed the door. And I'm sitting on my knees, like Poltergeist style, about 2 feet from the television. And that's just about when, what is it? Ralphie is on the window saying, Danny, let me in, Danny. And that was the end. Mr. Blue in Salem's Lot. And I kind of remember that pivot. It was like, I'm not going to watch these kinds of movies. I'm a kid and I'm kind of not going to do it. And of course, you get going through the teen years, I definitely, slumber parties and like kids get together and they put on movies in the background, but mostly that's not what it's not about watching the movies. So I could say I missed a lot of the formative sort of horror. And then I probably because of my relationship with Tom and his love of horror movies, he started introducing me to maybe what I would call some more sophisticated stories in horror movies. And so like now I can say safely one of my very favorite movies is Midsommar. I just absolutely adore that movie and I adore what it says. And so I've been really exploring more and more horror movies. And I'm excited to do this show because I feel like there are some huge holes that I've missed that I know you guys are going to introduce me to, especially Ray, who has an encyclopedic knowledge of classic horror. And so I'm really excited to start playing with some of these. He's holding up a book, but his green screen does not allow us to see it because it's a green book. It's the invisible book. Anyway, that's
more
kind
terrifying
of my
than technology.
I would say that my exploration really started 4 years ago maybe, and I've been trying to amp up the things that I'm willing to see, and as a result, I think I'm willing to see a lot more. I feel like I'm I'm a little bit dead inside, and I don't feel quite so strongly about the things that I'm seeing. So, movies like Relic, a absolutely fantastic story, ultimately about mothers and daughters, that is horrifically portrayed, so those kinds of movies I'm really really interested in.
Notably not The Relic, which
No,
is
Yeah,
please
about
I was
don't.
thinking the same
That's
thing
not
too.
the one. Yeah.
Right.
Speaking of terrible
I
adaptations,
Yeah.
and I have a particular subgenre of horror that I have not dabbled in, and we could talk about that in a minute. That's the one I bring to the table for this particular show, so I'm excited about it.
all right, then rounding out our quartet, our classic film buff, Ray, tell us what turned you on to the spooky stuff.
Well, I think
What if he talked like the Crypt Keeper the whole time
whole
and none of us
time.
talked about it?
Well-
Well, boys and ghouls.
Well, I think when I was a little kid, I must have had one of those faces where when you see it, you just want to scar that kid for life. Because when I swear, when I was a little kid, everybody was out to get me. There were these two preteens that my mom would babysit from time to time. And whenever my mom was trying to get something done and she wasn't really paying that much attention, they would force me to watch Jason Voorhees. I was 4 years old.
There
They're
we go.
watching Friday the 13th, the final chapter, and Jason is like slicing people up with corkscrews and stuff. And, you know, and then I'll never forget, my grandmother thought it would be funny to show me a scary movie. She showed me The Tingler, which admittedly for somebody,
Yeah,
you know, like it's not
That's
a scary movie to us now, but when you're a little kid, there's one particular scene where there's a character who is a deaf mute. She's seeing these visions. It's a black and white movie, and she's seeing like this blood, which is actually in color. So in a black and white movie, there's this bathtub filling up with red blood, and it's like one of the creepiest things you'll ever see. That haunted me for a while. And
Did your grandma hook you up to an old school tingler like they had in the theater where she could zap
Yeah,
you?
right. That was
would've
my
been
first
awesome.
introduction to like what you could do in a theater, were the
Yeah.
stories of my mom and dad telling me,
Vessel, yeah.
seeing it in the theater with
Right, yeah.
Percepto, right? That whole
Mhm.
sense around every other seat would get zapped randomly, and that's thrilling. That's really exciting.
Right. And so I grew up with those kind of movies. You know, when I was a little kid, I would watch those. And I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house, and she had a lot of the old classic monster movies, like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. I remember I watched that a lot. It wasn't until I was a teenager, though, that I really got into the genre whenever AMC started showing some of the Halloween sequels. And so, like, I discovered Halloween 5, which is like the worst Halloween movie ever, but that's what got me into the Michael Myers franchise. And it really just took off from there. I became a huge George Romero fan when I was in high school, and I grew up in the same area that they shot all those movies. So, you know,
Oh,
my
wow.
friends and I would go to the Monroeville Mall where they would shoot Dawn of the Dead, and we'd stand in front of J.C. Penney and we'd be like, my old granddad was a witch doctor in Trinidad. When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth. And there's just people walking by like, what the hell are these kids doing? So that's basically my story. You know, I like a very wide variety of horror.
That's a good pivot point then. Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about sort of the sort of areas of horror that we're into. Well, since Ray's had the mic, I'll pass it back over. So Tommy, like, what are the particular like types of horror movies that you can use specific examples if you want to, or you can just talk about sort of more general themes and ideas.
First of all, I'm very excited to do this with all of you, and in particular Ray, because I don't have much of a background in classic. I'm not a classicist movie person. For a while, I remember thinking that Citizen Kane wasn't the best movie ever made. It's just the first movie ever made. Like I was very against like old equals good, but I want to learn more about that stuff. So that's exciting. Yeah, I am definitely into psychological horror. Not as much
Mm.
monsters, not as much slashers, although there are great examples for each of those
Mm.
in stuff, but looks into the unknown, sometimes cosmic horror, things like that. One of the things that I have always been a little low-key obsessed with is hell, the afterlife,
Mm,
and the
sure, yeah.
idea of visions of hell in literature and film. Um, and so that's the kind of stuff like the looking beyond the black curtain, the velvet rope, the red curtain in David Lynch stuff. The idea of just on the other side of us is stuff that is really hard to understand. And to get like little tantalizing glimpses of that is always very fascinating. That and the idea of madness. Madness is the worst. Is that a good answer? I don't know if
No,
that's a
that's
good
good. That's
No,
good.
So
that's
ghosts.
awesome.
I love ghosts. I love haunted houses, things like
Mm.
that, things that break the norms of society.
Okay. All right. So then let's go over to Pete then. So what are the things that horror types that you
Well,
enjoy?
I enjoy the fun of B and C level monster movies.
Okay.
We were talking before we started. I just watched Dino Shark, which was extraordinarily bad, and I
I don't
still
think that's
loved it.
B or C.
Yeah,
R.
right. So I like the psychological stuff. I used to think that I didn't care so much for paranormal stuff, but there are some really good paranormal movies, and that sort of leads into the area that I just don't watch, but am kind of using this show as therapy. My earliest memory of this particular nightmare was actually reading the book Red Dragon,
Mm.
which consists of the bad guy sitting in the trees looking into a family's window and eventually goes in and does some horrible things to them. So stalker / home invasion horror
Mm.
is a real trouble spot for me. That gives me some peak anxiety. And so I have a list. I've been asking around. I have a list of some movies that sort of did that I've seen little bits of, but not the whole thing, that I want to kind of force myself through with the aid of your able counsel. And so I'm
Okay. So
excited to talk about that. I have
it's something
not
that
seen them.
triggers you, but
Yeah.
you're you're sort of also
I'm
one that
excited to
tests
move through it. Yeah, they
So
look like
so that
interesting
genre will be
movies.
your
Yeah.
sitting in the basement.
That's it.
Right.
That's my
thing.
sitting in the basement. That's exactly right.
Exposure therapy.
We
That's
have a
another
new
possible
thing.
title.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
All right.
All right, so that's so then Ray, as previously discussed, we know that you love the black and white. So what is it about that, and then what else is there in your particular spheres?
Sure. I mean, I love the old horror movies going all the way back to like 1910 to whenever Thomas Edison produced the first Frankenstein short film. I mean, there's just so much it's kind of like discovering your ancestry in a way. And this is the ancestry of horror. You're looking back at where what we love now has come from. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
like, oh,
Yeah.
dude, I didn't realize that what we find so great in this modern movie actually was inspired by this really cool thing in like Nosferatu or the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or
Mhm.
something like that. So that's what
Totally.
I really like about those movies. It's not very often that I'll get frightened by something that old, by anything really. I mean, but it's actually a quote that sticks with me, is something I heard from Bram Stoker in a DVD extra. And it's something along the lines of the desire to be frightened is almost as universal as the desire to be loved. And when he
Ooh.
said that, that always stuck with me because like that's true to an extent. Even people that don't like scary movies per se, like they'll seek out thrills in some other way, like roller coasters or what have you.
Right.
This is our thrill,
Mhm.
you know, our excitement, our joy.
I like that it made it sound like Bram Stoker recorded a DVD extra.
I know. That's what I heard.
When he was looping.
Just click on the menu to get to the list of chapters.
I actually think he was interviewed for a behind the scenes thing on Halloween. They were talking to different filmmakers about the legacy of John Carpenter's Halloween. And I think that was where I got that from. But he was one of the
Fascinating.
people interviewed.
So for me, it sort of crystallized when I was listening to the Dana Gould Hour. So Dana Gould is a podcast. He has a very very podcast that I absolutely love, and he has his own particular obsessions that he talks about too. And he said it became clear to him later that when people talk about horror movies, he's like, oh, I don't like horror movies. I like monster movies, and that was like, oh, that what clicked for me. That's what it is for me. So I like a monster. So I like, and that comes with all the supernatural stuff. So I mean, whether it be vampire or werewolf or full on creature or alien or whatever it is, I like people versus nature. I guess when you get right down to it, but basically something a monster, a creature. I like that much more than a guy with a knife.
Sure.
Like
Sure,
I'm
yeah.
not as big like serial killer movies, and like there's the best ones. Yeah, I really like those too. But when you get down, like I don't really just want to see a guy do like the same thing with the home invasion stuff. I don't really watch any of those because I'm just like, yeah, if it can happen in the real world, I don't really care. Like,
Well, that's the interesting thing, though, Kyle. Like,
I'm talking about just in terms of what we like. I'm not
it's
judging
not even what we
anybody.
like. I don't like it because it gives me real world anxiety. And I
Right.
feel like that's the boundary pushing part. That's the sitting in the basement part. Like,
Yeah.
if it can happen in real life and they do it well on screen, that's true terror for me. I don't have any real fear beyond the imminent jump scares in Aliens, like those movies. I love those movies so much. But when they're over, I don't bring them home. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much so.
And in the same way, I don't have any particular interest in watching something that could actually happen because it could actually happen. So like, I'd rather something that's more extreme, and then also to see, I guess, the human resilience in terms of like, how do you face this thing? How do you stop this killer robot? How do you stop this blob? Whatever it is that sort of come together. And once again, I don't that if the monsters win, okay. Like like that that's where my hypocrisy stands. Like I'm not looking for like mankind standing triumphant with the flag and the monster's skull. Like no, sometimes the monsters can win because if they didn't do things right or were selfish or didn't pull together or whatever it is. But I would much rather go for that. And then other one is as I've seen all Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street and all that kind of stuff, all of those from when they're sort of in their prime eras. But it wasn't until like the Mystery Science Theater of it all where a friend of mine was like, "But have you seen a terrible horror movie?" Where I was like, "No," and he sat me down and maybe watch The Stuff. And so from that, I got a real taste for like, I just love big ideas and no money. Like when people are just like we really want to do this, we are not prepared for it. We have no money for it, but by God, we're going to do it. So I love a Blair Witch. I love anything where it's just people trying hard to do something low budget and spooky, and sometimes it's outside their level of talent. And that's also another weird sort of crosshair because like when you get to like your Sharkgator or whatever kind of stuff, when they're intentionally bad, that kind of like that turns me off too. When they're just like, well, I don't know, we got like $10 million from Sci-Fi Channel, crab plus squid, there you go, where we're gonna make that movie. I kind of go, it seems so cynical,
Right.
Like
Yogurt Gator.
just like two things. I mean, like once again, I'm not yucking anybody's yum. If that's what you enjoy, great. It's just like that doesn't really do a lot for me because it just seems like it's just the straight up. It's the beach movie formula. Like, what do people like? They like this, they like that, and they like B level or C level actors and actresses getting killed by those things. Great. Here, go make that movie. It's
You
like,
can't really make kitsch or cult on purpose.
Yes, exactly.
And you can
that's
see
the whole
through it
Sharknado
very
of it all,
easy.
where it's
Right.
like, this seems corporate to me. Like,
But
this
you know
seems
what's so
corporate.
funny about it is that Sharknado, like the first one, actually had some laughs to it, like genuine fun,
Yeah.
and the rest of them fit the rest of that bill, right?
Yeah.
Another interesting bit that it was actually Nick Langdon in our community who got me onto Soviet science fiction films.
Ooh.
Okay.
That was a fascinating thing because it tells bonker stories, and it does it in a way that I would never expect, and it is culturally and ideologically frozen, right? Because so much has changed in Soviet, now Russian filmmaking. So that's another area I think I might be interested in exploring, and I've got a couple of films on my list that are foreign films, but not any of the like the sort of cultural throwback movies, the like sort of mid-level 60s, 70s, 80s from other cultures making movies. That might be another fun area. I think I only am now remembering. I think I would like that. Let's look at like Soviet horror. What was Soviet era, scared of? Like, and how did that manifest on screen?
I was reading an article about apocalyptic stories and how like you can sort of trace a culture by what their apocalypses are. So like from the 80s, it was the nuclear disaster of the day after, and and Mad Max Road Warrior versus Mad Max Fury Road, which are telling very different stories.
Right.
And they were talking about, yes, but like all of those are from a Western perspective because all of those are about this is what we've lost. But when you find filmmakers from places from the diaspora kind of thing, when like from cultures like that have been controlled by other more powerful steamrolling kind of cultures, those apocalypse stories are very different because it's aspirational. It's what can like the rules have changed. What can we gain?
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that's interesting.
When the world ends, that's a new beginning.
Yeah, I'm interested, like the difference between Shaun of the Dead and Juan of the Dead.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I'm so interested in like that's an idea that has like sparked in my brain. I'm like, I want to find horror movies that are like that way, that from like you're talking about from other cultures, different perspectives, as opposed to it's a normal suburban day. Then what? Because like something's wrong with that boy. That kind of stuff. So like you said, that I hadn't even heard of any Russian horror movie kind of stuff. So that's fascinating to me. So that's interesting to me is finding that kind of stuff where something I hadn't even considered that existing.
They're not easy to find, but then suddenly they're all on YouTube all at once. So
praise to the uploaders.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you guys know in the Soviet Union, science fiction watches you? Are you Smirnoff jokes?
I saw it coming down the road and I couldn't make it out, and then it was. So,
you speaking of yucking someone else's yum, I do think that's an interesting point, particularly in the guise of horror. And I again want to toss to Tom because we had this conversation. We've had an ongoing conversation. I think from one of our late Saturday matinees. Maybe you were on it, Kyle, when Tom brought the trailer Skinamarink.
Oh yeah.
And we have now, at least Tom has now seen it. And I thought, Tommy, your description of it was really great as an example of, man, this movie's not for everybody and what impact it made of you.
Yeah, it's the reviews are pretty much across the board are this movie is incredibly terrifying, or is this a prank? Because this is the most boring movie I've ever seen. And there's really no in between. For me, it's the most scared I've been in a theater in the last 10 years. It struck every kind of, and nothing happens, but it is just, I mean, it can be a hell vision. It can be
atmosphere.
All sorts of, yes. And I had to apologize to the person in front of me because during one of the quote unquote jump scares, I kicked the seat in front of me, and he turned around and because he yelled too, because I was his personal tingler.
You're like, did you see that?
Yeah. So I mean, that's and so many other people are like, literally like, is this just a cultural joke?
Right.
Because it's just so slow. Like for the first 20 minutes, I was like, oh, okay, well, this is just a complete failed experiment. And then when Kaylee goes upstairs and is asked to look under the bed, I realized, oh, I am completely in this movie's hands. And then at one point, as I told Pete, and then I'll wrap it up because it's not good to talk about things that other people haven't seen that much, but the level that I was enraptured by the movie and wanted to stay had been matched by wanting to leave.
Wow.
And nothing happens. There's no gore. I mean, it's children in peril, but it's not like there's things running around after them. But I was genuinely upsetting and thrilling, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. So yeah, that is a good example of that's a good example of what we bring, what you bring yourself to movies, because clearly, for reasons that I won't go into right now, it is a horror movie tailor-made for me based on my own nonsense. And so yeah, it was thrilling.
It's also remarkably the movie that I like hearing Tom talk about it that way and knowing what scares him and what doesn't. I don't want to see that movie.
Right.
I'm just not into that.
Right.
Probably fits well in the pushing boundaries kind of exposure therapy category.
For those that haven't heard of it, it was a movie that cost $15,000 to make. It was found at a film festival. It was bought by Shudder, and they teamed up with someone else, and they released it in theaters. It has made over $2 million, and now it is streaming on Shudder right now.
Yeah, that's interesting to talk about. Yeah, it means to talk about as we develop along it, to talk about the difference of budget, because like there are a lot of really expensive horror movies that do not work at all, and a lot of really cheap ones that do.
Yeah.
So it's you can see like throwing money at a horror movie does not necessarily mean it's going to be scary. It just usually means that there's going to be more CG things coming at you. So yeah, so I guess as this is developing, so we all had a bunch of different ideas about what we wanted to talk about and stuff too. So rather than having a sort of typical sort of next reel sort of like, and each week we pick a movie, there's a bunch of different areas that we wanted to go into it. So this will kind of be a train car full of like there's going to be different things we're going to be talking about, because each of us are sort of going to be leading discussions in little mini episodes about that with various combinations of the rest of us, and sometimes just even solo if we would just want to just do a straight up monologue about you need to watch this movie. And so like let's talk a little bit about sort of what some of the things you are thinking of in terms of nothing formal. You don't have to name your individual shows, but like talk a little bit about sort of what some of the areas you want to focus on and the podcasts you want to do. So Pete, yeah, I know you had come up with a list. You were more prepared than the rest of us.
I have a list.
What do you got? So tell us about some of the things you want to talk about.
Yeah,
in future episodes.
These are movies that in some cases I haven't seen all of them. I haven't seen. I can say confidently, I've seen none of them. One of them I've seen parts of, and sort of turned me off on the entire subgenre of invasion horror. First one comes highly rated. That is Marcus Dunstan's 2009 The Collector, which seems like an interesting film, and I think that one I think that one fits the bill for me as something I might like because it ends up being two bad guys against each other. So I'm okay. I'm kind of okay with that. Like I could do that.
It's the X versus Sever of horror movies?
Yes, right. When we go back to some like classics of the genre, I think 1979's When a Stranger Calls, Fred Walton, starring Carol Kane and Charles Durning, is one I haven't seen. Again, comes extraordinarily highly recommended in terms of tormenting the babysitter horror, and so I'm excited to kind of put that on the list as black and white scares. Another one. This is the one I've seen
because anyone only talks about the first half.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Yeah.
Like the first half goes, and then the movie continues, and I think everyone turns it off.
Is the second half particularly just boring or predictable?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, the first half is the call is coming from thing
inside the house,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. The other one that is this was a rough one, and I haven't made it through it and so I feel like I've seen just enough of it to be terrified and not get the joke. And that is Michael Haneke's 1997 Funny Games.
Oh, yep.
Rough. Rough. A lot of fourth wall breaking, and I feel like the relationship that film builds with the audience is terrifying, and I don't like it. That's one that sort of defines exposure therapy for me. Another one I haven't seen at all is a French film called Them. Two people live in an isolated country house. One day they wake up to a strange noise. They're not alone. A group of hooded assailants terrorize them throughout the night. Comes highly recommended. The next one is Inside. This one is one of the most interesting stories of intimate horror. 4 months after the death of her husband, a woman on the brink of motherhood is tormented in her home by a strange woman who wants her baby. That's another French film, Inside, 2007.
Okay.
I've just a couple more. That's not funny. Last House on the Left, Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, 1972. Rough. What I hear is there is a rough sequence of violence right in the beginning, but the rest of it is kind of a predictable bit of revenge horror. So there's that. Kidnapped Anybody seen Kidnapped? 2010.
Mm.
In terms of experimental film, it's three hooded Eastern European criminals burst into a home in Madrid gated community, holding the family hostage in its own home and forcing the father to empty his credit cards. But what's interesting about it is it's an entire movie, an 84-minute movie made of 12 shots.
Wow,
Whoa.
Nice.
I am intrigued by that movie. So that's
Yeah.
one that I feel like might end up high on the list. And finally, I think this one, I think this one, I know at least one person who will join me to talk about this movie. Story of a deaf and mute writer who retreated into the woods to live a solitary life, must fight for her life in silence when a masked killer appears at her window. That's Mike Flanagan's Hush in
Mhm.
2016. So that's my list. I feel like of movies that could potentially push me into some new areas. I think it's a mix of intriguing, experimental, and really sort of uncomfortable boundary pushing across the last 3 or 4 decades.
That's a great list.
All right, I'm gonna go to Tommy next because I know Ray also has a list, and I think Tommy does not have a list.
I
Neither
don't-
do I.
And I wanted to point out that not
basically tell me some of the areas, like what you're interested in.
because also
examining.
we wanted to say that not every episode is just going to be about one movie. It can be
Right.
about an idea
Sure.
of horror.
Yep.
One of the things that I want to talk about at one point is the difference between horror and terror.
Yeah.
That those two things get lumped together a lot, and I feel that there's very blurred but distinct lines between the two and how that goes. I would like to talk about hell in movies and the different kinds of ways that hell can exist. Another thing I wanted to talk about was monster theory. One of the things that I think works the best in horror is liminality. It's the idea of in monster theory it's called, one of the monsters is a harbinger of categorical crisis. And another word to say is
Oh.
liminality, the idea of that we believe we have these codes and our building blocks of what things are, and
Yeah.
things that blur those can be very subconsciously, in addition to consciously scary. One of the best versions of that I want to go over is the alien in Alien. That the
Oh.
amount of gender
Yeah.
things that goes into it, blends machine, it blends monster, it blends animal, it messes up the entire male versus female thing. One of the biggest enemies in the entire thing is called Mother,
Mhm.
which is the robot ship. And so just little things like that of ways to really
I hear the sound of H.R. Geiger
Mhm.
scratching at his coffin,
Yes.
wanting to be on that episode.
Yeah.
Yes. That weirdo. Yeah, so those kind of things. I promise it won't be boring, but it will be a little academic at times, or just trying to figure out some of the things of what. Oh, I also want to talk about the history of the Book of the Vampire, one of the most oldest and most used tropes in horror movies. And
Okay.
and I'll be taking a page out of Ray's book, tracking it all the way back to the first time. We don't call it the Book of the Vampire anymore, but that's what it is. The
Wow.
end.
Okay, I say you're not typically a vampire fan.
No, I'm not. And it doesn't have to do with vampire. You'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just before I get to Ray, I was just watching. A comedian was talking about all the different genres and sort of what they represent, and that how like vampires are about youth, like it's about staying young forever,
Mhm.
and like werewolves are a metaphor for alcoholism. Oh God, what did I do last night? You wake up and you've
Yeah.
lost control. So yeah, and then
Cool.
zombies can become anything. like
Yeah.
like
Right.
whatever you're afraid of.
What do you wanna
It's like,
say?
that's what it is. Yeah, exactly. It's like, is it the lower class rising up to take over? Is it being outnumbered by people who are different than you? Like the zombies can be so malleable in terms of what you want them to be.
I just want to say, just in terms of background, I am deep in the bag for zombies. Zombies
Oh,
are
yeah.
my very, very favorite of all the monsters.
Yeah.
And so anyone who brings zombies, count me in.
Okay.
Big fan.
All right, so yeah, then Ray, you gave a long list. You don't have to go down all the list of all the things you want to do, but give us a couple things that you're excited to talk about.
Well, real quick, I think since Tommy mentioned, gender roles in horror movies, I think we should plug real quick that listeners, you should listen to the new episodes of The Next Reel where they talk about the Slumber Party Massacre.
Ah.
Yeah. That's
But-
been a fun exploration of decreasingly quality films.
Yeah.
But I mean, I feel like a broken record here, but I'd love to be able to talk about silent movies. I particularly love
Oh yes.
from the German Expressionist period movies
Some
like
Nosferatu.
The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari,
Yes.
The Golem,
Mm-hmm.
Nosferatu, which is generally considered to be one of the best silent films ever. Tommy wanted to talk about like Hell and Witchcraft. One great silent movie from Sweden that's really great is Haxon, which talks
Oh.
about witchcraft through the ages. But
Mhm.
the movies of producer Val Lewton, like Cat People, The Body Snatcher, that came out in the 40s, late
Mhm.
30s, 40s. Those would be great movies to talk about. Pete wanted to talk about zombies. I think it'd be interesting to
Mhm.
talk about, like, if you look at horror, there are kind of two versions of the zombie. There's the zombie that we know that like eats flesh or in some instances brains, and that's what was introduced in Night of the Living Dead in 1968. But then before that, zombies in film were a result of voodoo, and they were much differently portrayed in movies like White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie, and Hammer had a movie called The Plague of the Zombies, things like that. It'd be really interesting just to check that out and see the progression of zombie horror. But
I'm-
those are just a couple of ideas.
Absolutely in the bag for that. Yeah, for sure.
All right. So for then for me, like we talked about creature features. I want to talk about monsters. I want to talk about like sort of monsters from the monster's perspective, like to sort of look at even the relic, like from like what is its goal, what is it trying to do, what is it do? Sort of take like have it like as is the main character. Let's do a character study on whatever the creature is that's trying to do this, because some of them are very clearly defined and some of them are really not. So it's interesting to look for that. I'm interested in remakes, like to basically like that somebody did a really effective, low budget, like even Last House on the Left, like actually what made me think of it. And then another filmmaker comes along with a huge budget and stars and does it again, and it doesn't work. It's like I'm interested in that. Looking at that, and some do. It's not always bad, but even When a Stranger Calls, they did a remake of that, like to try and see when someone goes back to the exact same story and tells it again in a modern setting with them, in like even what Rear Window and Disturbia, like I mean, to take the exact same thing and do it again in a quote unquote modern setting with things, and sort of look at those and does it work, and does it to sort of compare and contrast.
Just a warning, if you ever talk about the remake of Psycho, you might have to put an explicit warning on that episode, because I will go off like a
Becoming unhinged just thinking about it.
The Gus Van Sant of it all.
Well, what's interesting about that, just since Ray already brought it up, the Slumber Party Massacre remake in 2021, which was compared to the original a level up bananas effort to swing so big and do something that's really different. And does it always succeed? No, but is it absolutely worth thinking about? Yes, it is.
I'm interested in also then where genres cross over. So like there are a lot of things where it's horror plus whatever. So like Ghostbusters kind of is like horror plus comedy. I don't. People talking a lot about Ghostbusters. I wouldn't use that as an example, but just the idea of them crossing over. So like I recently rewatched Constantine, which is horror comic book kind of thing, and it works. Like I was really surprised that in the modern day to watch it again and go, oh wow, so much of this movie really works.
Yeah.
And so like and sort of when they've combined horror with other things, and when it works and when it doesn't. To sort of to talk about that a little bit, as opposed to like basically to set it in there to have the slash horror slash
the Cabin in the Woods, of course.
Yeah,
Fits
exactly.
handily.
Yeah.
In that
Cabin in the Woods, one of the rare movies that makes other movies better when you watch it.
Right.
There's a great bunch of movies that blend horror and comedy. It'd be interesting to go back and take a look at, which ones pioneered that.
Oh yeah, to go back to the Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, I'll tell you what, I am very excited about the prospect of this show. We as you can see, we have a lot we want to talk about, and as Kyle said, it's not going to be one single series that comes out regularly every week, every other week. We're going to explore multiple different sort of sub-series within whatever the show turns out to be, and it will be some combination of us, and we're going to just work together to explore horror in hopefully, if not a way that's new to you, it's certainly going to be a way that's new to us, at least some of us. And maybe that's what it's called. New to us, not to you. And shows will start coming out. I'm going to go ahead and plant a flag. Shows will start coming out in the next month. What do you think? We could do that. We can commit to that.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah. And then I think periodically, then the four of us will then come back together to sort of talk about something, a larger idea, or if an atomic bomb drops on the horror genre of something huge that has to be discussed.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Scott. This was actually Kyle's pitch, but he has construction going on at his house, so he can't talk right now.
Unless you love the sound of beeping.
Thanks, Kyle, for your idea. Kyle Olson and Tommy, the handsomest of the Metzes. And oh my gosh, look, it's Ray of the Delancey Rays. Thank you guys so much. This is going to be a great series. I'm Pete Wright, and we'll see you next time on whatever the show ends up being called.